Hi, my name is Megan Turner, and today I'm going to be discussing racism, crime, and journalism. So, here's an overview of what we're going to be looking at. We're going to start with an introduction before moving into my secondary research, my own primary analysis methodology, my themes and findings, some key takeaways. We'll look at my own writing, and then some overall conclusions. So, let's begin with an introduction. On the 5th of September 2022, Chris Carver was fatally shot in his car by Metropolitan Police Officer Sergeant Martin Blake. The officers on scene were at the time unaware of Carver's connections to a nightclub shooting days prior. The officer claimed he felt his and his colleagues' lives were in danger, with Carver trying to flee. On the 21st of October 2024, Sergeant Blake was cleared of all charges. This sparked protesting within the community, particularly within the Black Lives Matter movement. So, how does this link to journalism? Well, Chris Carver's death has been heavily reported in the media, but with a strong focus on the character and lifestyle he allegedly was leading. Throughout the trial, the judge refused to accept any evidence that highlighted Carver's character negatively, but media reporting restrictions on his supposed involvement in gang violence was lifted at the end of the trial. And this arguably resulted in a media feeding frenzy about the victim. I want to investigate the type of language used to represent both Chris Carver and Martin Blake in tabloid and broadsheet newspapers. So, why this case in particular? Well, this is a recent case, with the trial concluding in October of this year. I think it's important to investigate racism in journalism because it has not yet reached a level of crisis because its systemic nature is built into the media system itself. The case sparked a powerful reaction of protests and reopened wounds and wars about police violence and Black Lives Matters. It's also important to understand the impact of racially motivated journalism. The cultivation theory suggests that heavy exposure to media shapes our conceptions of social reality, which highlights the influential role journalism has within society. So, what research already exists? It really stemmed from a sociological background. They identified the cultivation theory, which I have briefly touched upon. This recognises the relationship between society and the media and predicts that those with the most frequent and repetitive exposure to a particular media message are likely to accept these portrayals as accurate and truthful and internalise them in a way that the portrayals impact their attitudes, beliefs, or actions. So, my research question and methodology. So, my research question was, how do tabloid and broadsheet publications differ in their reporting of race? I selected 28 articles spanning a period of September 2022 to November 2024. 14 of the articles represent Chris Carver, with 7 taken from tabloid publications, including The Sun and the Daily Mail, and the remaining 7 from broadsheet papers such as the London Standard and the Guardian. The remaining 14 articles cover the representation of Sergeant Martin Blake, equally again across both types of publication. I conducted textual analysis to all data. This data gathering process is for researchers who want to understand the ways in which various cultures and subcultures make sense of who they are and how we fit into the world we live in. We are making an educated guess on some of the most likely interpretations that could be made of that text. I selected a variety of headlines from the tabloid and broadsheet publications and compiled them so you can really get an insight into the types of articles that I was reading. So I'll leave that for you to have a glance at. I've also included an example of my analysis. Now, this is a tabloid article which represented Chris Carver. I went through and highlighted the most significant lexical choices. Now, the superlative most is a form of exaggeration. It implies that there is nobody as powerful and as dangerous as Carver. The adjective shocking creates a sense of disgust and offensiveness, suggesting he was a disgrace to society, acting immoral at surprising lengths. And the adverb brazenly, it implies that he was carefree in his attempt to flee. Perhaps he was shameless in his actions, proud of his boldness. I also did the same analysis for a broadsheet representation of Chris Carver. Similarly, they also used the superlative most, but the journalist was very cautious with their phrasing throughout the article. They did not outright state that he was the most dangerous, and instead used terms such as are considered, is said to have, it was said. They also provided a more balanced view of character. It does comment on the alleged dangerous and violent persona of Carver, but it does acknowledge his role within his family life, describing him as a much-loved family man and father-to-be. Okay, so my overall findings for the representation of Chris Carver in the tabloid publication. So they represent Chris Carver as a core gang member with a violent history and criminal mindset. Across the 7 tabloid articles, there was a semantic field of violence and deceit, and this is identified through common nouns such as crook, gangster, thug, and mob. They appeared repeatedly in the articles, and they really did fuel this stereotyping of a ruthless gang leader. Now, media stereotyping can be defined as reoccurring messages that associate persons of colour with traits, behaviours, and values generally considered undesirable, inferior, or dangerous. The superlative most featured across all articles and was often followed by a verb such as feared or dangerous. It implies that his actions were the worst of his kind because they add this level of exaggeration, really emphasising that verb or adjective that it follows. The tabloid articles were built on sensationalised language. They included the noun phrases bloody feud, battering ram, and adverbial phrases brazenly gunned down. It's very elaborate language which paints this picture of chaos, violence, an uncontrollable man. Multiple articles also use capitalisation and graphics to exaggerate his character and supposed gang life. Now we have the overall findings for the representation of Sergeant Martin Blake in the tabloid publication. Now, Sergeant Martin Blake has not been visually identified across any media outlet out of fear for his safety. The tabloid articles represent Blake as a hero, but also a victim of injustice. The articles focus on his acquittal and his well-being. He was described as finally ending the rampage. The adverb finally implies that he was the hero for killing Carver, and it once again depicted Carver as this out-of-control madman. Multiple articles describe Blake as fearing for his and his family's life. The past participles fearing and the noun hiding, they create this discourse of sympathy and unfairness, and it arguably does fuel this further hatred towards Carver for damaging this married father of 2. Okay, so my overall findings for the representation of Chris Carver, but in the broadsheet publication. So they did provide a more balanced outlook on his life. As I said, the journalist really did refrain from outrightly describing Carver as a violent criminal and used more cautious phrasing to describe his supposed involvement. They refrained from sensationalised language, given that his death does result in his loss of a right to reply and defend himself. Multiple of the broadsheet articles also reference not only Carver's alleged gang involvement, but also elements of his personal life, describing him as a much-loved family man. It provides a more balanced account and makes sure that we're not just exposing the reader to one negative discourse. Another theme was the mention of Carver's music talent. One paper described it as the first of its kind to enjoy mainstream popularity and chart success. It implies that he wasn't just a criminal. He was a talented musician, and it also adds this level of humanisation to him. Okay, and then we have the findings for the representation of Sergeant Martin Blake in the broadsheet publication. So it was actually quite similar to that of the tabloid. They represented him in a very heroic light. They focused on the challenges that he faced, described him as being hauled through the courts, They really did have this representation of his acquittal as unanimous and really held his position as officer in high regard. There was definitely a feeling of injustice as well identified in these articles, um, almost a system that punishes them for their job. Okay, so my key differences and takeaways. The tabloid publications heavily relied on sensationalised language to create a negative discourse of violence towards Kaba. They did fall victim to media stereotyping. Broadsheet publications used very cautious phrasing when describing Kaba's supposed gang life, but both publications did represent Sergeant Martin Blake as a heroic man who was unfairly treated by the justice system. When conducting my own writing, I must refrain from sensationalised phrasing and must provide a balanced overview of the situation to avoid stereotyping and a biased narrative. Okay, so my own writing. I decided to write my very first long form article, so it was a bit of a challenge. Inspiration for this was from a recent event in Manchester at the Christmas markets. It saw the police issue a dispersal order, which sent members of the travelling community back onto the trains following reports of antisocial behaviour. Locally, Birmingham City Council have also announced plans to improve relations between the council and the travelling community by recognising the lack of permanent stopping areas. I published this article onto my own blog, but I would pitch it to a local alternative publication, such as Birmingham Dispatch. So, Dispatch are known for their in depth pieces. They often pick a few stories about politics, social affairs, and they really dig into them properly. So, I feel like this would best suit my long form piece. If I wanted to publish this in Manchester, which is obviously where the incident did take place, I would solely focus the article on Manchester and would pitch it to a magazine such as Manchester Magazine, again, due to the longevity of the piece. I've included some screenshots of my writing, and we can see how my analysis influenced my decisions. Again, I use cautious phrasing, such as were accused, appeared to show, and I also ensured that both parties had the right to reply. We have a statement from the Travellers Times, and we also have a statement from Greater Manchester Police. This really creates a balanced view. I also use social media embeds to really highlight public opinion, and I also wanted to ensure I was representing some of the positive elements of the travelling community. I also use data and statistics to educate my reader, and again, a bit more cautious phrasing. Okay, so my overall conclusions. Chris Carber's murder did result in a media frenzy, with the tabloid publications representing him as a careless, violent criminal, heavily involved in gang activity, and who ultimately deserved to die. Whilst there's some evidence to suggest that Carber was involved in shootings and had previous criminal convictions, his death does violate his right to defend and reply, so journalists are really only relying on one sided sources. The tabloid publications did fall victim to racial stereotyping and perhaps created an ethnic blame narrative because they would assume that this narrative pervades the population and would increase their ratings. Broadsheet publications were a lot more conscious in their reporting of the crime. They did refrain from outrightly determining Carber's alleged criminal past. It is challenging to determine whether this villainisation and relentless trialing of Carber by the media is fueled by an institutional racist motive, but my analysis does support this claim that we don't investigate racism in journalism because its systemic nature is really built into the system itself. Media language is very complex in terms of its socio-economic and communicative context. So, moving forward, journalists need to be a lot more cautious and conscious in their linguistic choices to prevent any biased narratives. My investigation into racism with journalism, particularly in the reporting of crime, has definitely revealed a level of dehumanisation and rationalisation. It almost justified the death of a black man. The media latched onto a pre existing stereotype in society of black men and gang culture. Whilst I do feel my textual analysis was in depth, the process can be considered highly subjective, as this methodology requires only one interpretation of the text, and that was conducted by myself. Moving forward, I would apply this same process to another high-profile case concerning an individual of colour and the police force to identify any reoccurring patterns of stereotyping by the media. But overall, we must address this wider issue of societal stereotyping and how this is being reinforced within the media. I've also provided a link to some of the references, which has helped me with this research project. Thank you for listening.